This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 167 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Caleb Daniels. Caleb is a lifelong fan of the James Bond films and novels, as well as a firearms enthusiast from Kansas City, Missouri. For 7 years, he worked in the firearms industry. In 2020, he started the website and social media pages titled Commando Bond, which are a passion project of his to bridge the gap between pop culture and the world of firearms by analyzing how to live like James Bond from his daily carry to his wardrobe and lifestyle. I invited Caleb onto the podcast today to discuss his book, Licensed Troubleshooter, The Guns of James Bond, which is available for pre-order now from Headstamp Publishing. Caleb has spent years researching all the firearms that appeared in the Bond books and films, and is now finally sharing that research with us. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Paul L. and Mason S. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Caleb, thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure to finally connect in this way, man. It's been a long time coming, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I know. I think that we met in person. It was a year and a half ago, right? Like January 2023, I think.
Yeah, was that the first SHOT Show? I was at the Alchemy booth. Is that right? I was working the knife bench, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned this project to me then, and I was very excited. And here we are, 18 months later, discussing the fruits of your labor, so to speak.
Yeah, I think when we met, it was like 1 month after I had signed paperwork. So I had a publishing agreement. I was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and it was going to happen. And now here we are, and it's finally coming to fruition.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, but even going back, farther than 18 months, we, connected online like in 2020, I guess, since you started yours around the same time I started mine.
Yeah, I think we kind of fell on the interweb scene about the same time, and obviously we're in very similar subject matters, and quickly just kind of fell in and had a great time. It's been a lot of fun bouncing off of one another, collecting your books, and reading spy shots and stuff like that as little vignette pieces. It's really enjoyable for me.
I appreciate it, man. Yeah, it's been fantastic watching you grow as well. You've built this huge audience and around a lifestyle, really. And I got to tell you, I started out initially following quite a few, James Bond related accounts, of course, when I was getting my start. And honestly, nobody does it like you do. And nobody's got like the passion and the kind of the discipline that you do. And I've seen it take you to places I never expected, honestly. And I would imagine you feel the same way.
Every day something new happens, or someone calls and has some crazy concept. And it's something that when I was 12, I would have been dreaming of as a fantasy. And now it's just like, I guess we're doing that. And it's a blessing that I'll never take for granted. That's for sure. It's been an incredible, this last year especially has been insane. I really feel like 2024 was a big takeoff point. And with the book landing in 2025, finally, because we're in pre-sale now, I feel like 25 is just going to be a continuation of the chaos. And I'm absolutely here for it.
Terrific, man. Terrific. So what was it, going back to the beginning, what was it that kind of drew you to 007?
Yeah, I blame my grandfather, my dad's dad. He got me a 3-disc set of the Sean Connery movies back when I was probably like 10, 11, 12-ish. It was back when they were doing like the Ultimate Edition packages, which had no reason to be packaged the way they were. They weren't any sort of linear order. So I think I got like Thunderball, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and like I think also he's tacked on Diamonds Are Forever. I only remember that because I remember watching all of those and then being very confused why Sean Connery was so old and angry in the last one that I watched. It was jarring, but that got me immediately booked. Yesterday, actually, that was the 17th of September, was the 60th anniversary of Goldfinger, the film. And that was the big one. Like so many people back in the day, that really pushed me over the edge, because I grew up on like Batman the Animated Series. That's a fantastic show produced by Bruce Timm and stuff. And it had the cars and the gadgets and all the things. And so you take that love and you transition and you introduce me to James Bond, who also wears a suit of sorts, has a really fancy car laden with gadgets and all sorts of other cool things. It was a really easy transition. And, it was something that you could mature with a bit more. because when I was growing up, it wasn't cool. The Marvel thing really hadn't taken off yet. I graduated high school in 2016 to really make myself sound young but old, and so it wasn't really the thing yet. And so you didn't get to just say, yeah, I'm a big Batman guy. So James Bond was kind of a way to adult those passions up. And then, man, 25 films now. I'm probably like 22. Skyfall was my first one in theaters. And then I think the thing that encapsulates it all so well and why the character like was so fascinating to me is a thing that Sean Connery said once, and I say this a lot, but he said he never had to work so hard to make everything look so easy.
Hmm.
And I think like the philosophy of like ultimate competency and like with a character is so appealing for folks because it really is figuring out every situation, being able to be comfortable in your skin wherever you are, however you are. And I think that's an appeal on like a deeper level that makes the character very enjoyable, aside from obviously the thrills, the action, the gadgets, the explosions. So it all kind of self encapsulates. And then I'm also a massive history nerd. I mean, I grew up with the bookshelf of what the Geico ad would say, probably don't be like your parents. I had the World War II bookshelf when I was 10. So you know, I I I started out on the back foot there, and so the World War II history drama, the real world spies and stuff like that, all became super important to me and things that I really really cared about. So it all just made sense, and it all just fell in together very easily.
I see. So between your first foray with the DVD set and then 2020, was there like a turning point for you, kind of where this became like a focal point of your life, or did it just kind of gradually build over the years?
Yeah, so in 2020, I was graduating college. Frankly, I was bored as hell because my wife graduated at semester and I was kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere by myself. Not that I didn't have friends, but you're used to seeing someone every single day. I was like, man, I've got a lot of free time now. I had been dating the same girl for my entire collegiate experience and spent a lot of time with her. And I had a lot of downtime. And more importantly, I was a marketing major who had professors that I really enjoyed, but hadn't been in the field since the 80s. Like the director of marketing at my school, her primary focus of research was the impact of newspaper print ads in marketing.
Oh wow.
So uh, I was terrified of graduating into a volatile job space and not having any schema for for marketing. And I wanted to give a voice to things that I really cared about. It wasn't just like, oh, I need to figure out how to do Instagram, so I'll do this. That was one of the driving factors that I guess I used to justify doing a giant nerd account, right? But really, what it was, I felt like it was an underserved market inside the James Bond space where no one had really talked about the firearms as a lifestyle component. Some people were talking about guns at that time, but it was in this super hardcore vacuum. Like the gun existed by itself. To me, James Bond encapsulates competency with the firearms, competency with style, the whole nine yards, the full gamut. And so, you know, the necessity of doing all that meant a lot to me. But then also, I had worked at that time in the industry for the firearms industry for a very long time, and I still do now in other capacities. And I really felt that the best way to normalize the use of firearms for personal protection, self defense, recreation, the things that I deeply care about, was through this lens of pop culture. I knew that everyone in the world had some sort of touch point with James Bond, right? I mean, even there's rumors that South Korea was airdropping, VHSs of James Bond films into North Korea at one point. So like
Oh wow.
most people in the world have some sort of touch point with James Bond. And so to me, it's like, great, I can use this very famous character as an entry level position, drive people into my other passion, and blend the two together because I can talk authentically and somewhat competently on both subject matters.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I got it. Well, it's worked out. I mean, your original plan has really come to fruition, as far as I can tell, and you've got not just a
Appreciate
huge following, but people that I think are just generally inspired to learn more, which is certainly why I do it, and maybe why you're
that.
doing
Yeah.
it as well.
Absolutely. It's all about being an entry point into the things you care about, right? And giving folks when we get to some other topics, I hope we get to chat about today. And one of the things I had the most fun with my book is the acknowledgement section and like a reading list kind of that ties into all that, right? Because the real world history, I want you to read a book or see a post of mine or whatever and want to look into the topic more. I want you to fill your library shelves. I want you to go to the primary sources. That's what I did. And I have great enjoyment and pleasure out of that, and I think a lot of people will. So that's my goal is to build a megaphone to speak for people that aren't doing that and to
Hmm.
share their stories as best I can.
Awesome, fantastic. And so I'm glad you mentioned entry points. So let's talk about the entry point for James Bond to begin with. Let's go back to the author Ian Fleming.
Hmm.
And I think most people are aware that he wrote the books and they know that he had a little bit of a background, but they
Yeah.
may not know what that is exactly. So can you talk a little bit about Ian Fleming's own career and what ultimately led him to start writing the novels?
Yeah, so Ian Fleming had a very fascinating career. It's crazy the more I researched his biography for my book, because I opened the book talking about Ian Fleming and his life, because the character is so heavily tied back and forth, and that's just how things occur. And so, Ian Fleming was in naval intelligence during World War II, but what a lot of people don't know right out of the gate is Ian's father, Valentine, was also, he served in World War One. He actually served with Winston Churchill. Churchill himself actually wrote the obituary for Mr. Fleming, his
Hmm.
father, when he passed away. He was killed in combat. And so he wrote this beautiful obituary in the Times about Valentine Fleming. So, all these crazy little things that I kept finding like that. Well, like that's his early life. That's his father. And it seems to kind of just put him on this path where he ends up falling into being the personal aide to the rear admiral who was running the naval intelligence in World War II. And Fleming had a lot of really cool hands-on things. He was a very creative type before the Bond stuff. He had a lot of fantastical visions and imaginations, and kind of came up with some crazy concepts for what missions could be, for how things, how to pull the wool over the heads of the Germans and do all this sort of thing. In fact, Ben McIntyre has a fantastic book about one of these operations that Ian Fleming was part of the planning and the crazy world building of, which was Operation Mincemeat.
Hmm.
To trick the Germans with the dead body, the fake plans. But also, he got a lot of leeway because he was very creative, and he was a very charming person. He kind of was able to talk his way into a lot of things. And his boss, the Rear Admiral John Godfrey, was very, very fond of him. And he gave him a lot of latitude. And so much so, at one point, Ian Fleming actually founded his own commando unit during World War II. Uh,
Yeah, I was shocked to hear that. Yeah. What can you tell me a little bit more? I really don't know too much.
Absolutely. So 30 Assault Unit was the name of this group. And I want to thank you first and foremost here, because you kind of helped bridge some gaps here with this and another piece that we'll get to, I'm sure, through your connections. And it was very fascinating learning about 30 Assault Unit, because it's, as far as I can tell, and from what the biographies about the organization say, this was the first intelligence gathering special operations commando unit that ever existed. So the purpose of 30 Assault Unit was to land prior to other Allied forces, or to travel with Allied forces, and to get ahead of the force to capture German documents before they were burned, before they were destroyed, hidden, whatever the case may be. Um,
Oh man.
there was talk about them being part of, like, searching for nuclear programs, the V2 rockets, getting the research, fascinating stuff like that. And then also, it all the way got down to his team at one point actually capturing an Enigma machine, which happens well before he writes the novel From Russia with Love, which takes place with a similar device, an encoding machine and such. And so it's fun seeing the real world and Fleming's experiences
Hmm.
later in life inspiring his writing. But yeah, 30 AU still exists today. It's called the 30 Commando Unit. It used to be 30 Assault Unit. Now it's 30 Command. It's a really cool thing. There's a couple books that I do recommend if you're interested in the subject. The two that I read for my research were Fleming's Commandos, that's by Nicholas Rankin, and then another one for the history of 30 AU, Ian Fleming's Red Indians, and that was by Craig Cabell. Both were really helpful in kind of opening up the world of Ian Fleming prior to James Bond, because his biographies have talked about it to some degree, but it wasn't until, which I've only read snippets of, it's on my wish list to get. It's a volume. Nicholas Shakespeare just released a new biography of Ian Fleming that's a tome. It's a huge book. But I have seen the sections where he actually goes into depth. He actually interviewed a lot of the last surviving members or the family members of the original 30 Assault Unit team members. Because the one thing that I found in my reading that I found was really unique and special was that Fleming not only drafted a memo and founded the unit, so he gave it a purpose, he gave it a reason, he helped kind of create missions and concepts. He was also their biggest advocate. A lot of these guys talking about how he was making sure they had supplies, weaponry, tools, whatever the case may be, and they spoke very, very favorable of him in their later years, which is really cool, because it wasn't, I think it dispels the myth that Ian Fleming had some sort of tertiary contact with the world of espionage, and he was some sort of secretary exclusively.
Right.
I think people fail to realize how much Godfrey gave him. Now, at some point, Godfrey does get replaced, and Fleming kind of loses a lot of his latitude. But I mean, in the years that he did, he founded a commando unit. He helped design all sorts of, a lot of his stuff did get shot down because it was just so crazy in terms of like mission planning and stuff like that. But he got to travel to the United States, and he met Bill Donovan. This is where you and I kind of got to discuss a little bit with the OSS folks,
Mm-hmm.
which is so cool because for folks who don't know, Ian Fleming, because he had founded this commando unit, when he visited Bill Donovan, who at the time had not yet founded the OSS, he was stymied by the FBI, and there was all this back and forth of like, the Hoover team really trying to retain control of intelligence operations. And so he needed help. He needed help kind of figuring out how to do this. So Fleming writes him this letter, this memo that to some people might seem rather boring and might argue that, well, does it really have the effect that it did? It absolutely was this hugely important document to the founding of the OSS because Donovan knew the mission of the organization. What Fleming gave him was the blueprint to actually produce a successful intelligence apparatus, who to hire, how to break down the organization, like basically like the actual business plan for founding a unit, where to place it, who you should be putting in X roles. And it was fascinating. And that became later the cornerstone of the OSS charter, which of course would later become the CIA charter. So, Ian Fleming is one of the fathers of the OSS.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And you're right that people don't necessarily look to a memorandum as exciting World War II history, but it's so critically important to everything that comes afterwards. And he was right
Absolutely.
there.
Absolutely. And he did so many other crazy things too. A book that I really enjoyed too was Into the Lion's Mouth by Larry Loftus, talking about Dusko Popov, and, double agent, very famous during World War II, one of the many, many inspirations that people claim for Bond. But Fleming actually trailed him for a while. He actually kind of was his shadow, making sure that he wasn't a triple agent or whatever the term was. Watched him play poker, stuff like that. So Fleming really got to be in the thick of a lot of really fascinating things, and the world didn't happen around him. He actively took part in the things happening everywhere.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. So do you think that he had, aspirations as a novelist right from the start, or is that something that just kind of came in like a later phase in his life after the war had ended?
So during the war, he actually visited Jamaica with his friend Ivor Bryce. Mr. Bryce, great friend of his. You'll hear his name a lot when I talk about the early days of Ian Fleming and James Bond, because Bryce actually introduced Fleming to Jamaica, which is now you get off a plane in Jamaica, there is murals of Ian Fleming and James Bond saying the spiritual home and birthplace of James Bond.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I went to Montego for my honeymoon, and that was the first. I got off the plane. I'm like, well, I think we're in the right place, huh? So, but Bryce introduces him to Jamaica. This is back in 1944, so during World War II. It was at that time that he told his friend, he's like, yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and buy a home here and never look back. Now, he did return to London after the war pretty consistently, but he would always winter in Jamaica. He told his friend famously during World War II, another friend in British intelligence, that he intended fully to write the spy story to end all spy stories. So, he was a writer beforehand. He had written for some papers and stuff like that. And so I think that he always had some sort of like heavy creative inclination to him. And then, of course, he took part in the greatest war of our generation, like the true battle of good and evil that everyone always pulls back to. It's our Iliad for this generation, right? And he took part in that at a very personal level. And why wouldn't he write mythos about that after the fact? If you're creatively inclined and you got to see all the things that no one else got to, and you're bound by the Official Secrets Act, isn't the best way to keep sane to write fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what a lot of people do now after they get out of a career, is they can't write about their career, but they can write about something very, very similar happening to a fictional character, which is great.
Yeah. And I think Fleming did a magnificent job of all that. And so he didn't actually start, he buys the house in 1947. So he officially retires to Jamaica. He starts traveling to Jamaica, and Goldeneye was his home. So he buys this, I think it was a horse track at the time actually, and built a great house on there, which is now a 5-star resort. You can actually stay at Fleming's original villa. There's a corner desk where he kept a gold-plated typewriter where he would write all the Bond novels. The myth of this man is larger than life. And this is actually right there is a good story about Ivor Bryce as well. There's a fantastic book that actually has all of Ian Fleming's personal letters during his time writing the James Bond novels that was published a few years back, called The Man with the Golden Typewriter. And in it, one of his letters is to his friend Ivor Bryce saying that he would like him to buy a particular gold-plated Royal Deluxe typewriter, and to prevent import duties and customs, if his wife could please wrap it in one of her mini fur coats and conceal it and bring it across to Jamaica, that would be greatly appreciated.
Oh, wow.
So his friend was
Typewriter
going
and
to
a fur coat.
America a lot, so he was having him smuggle things for him. At one
Hmm.
point, he actually asked Bryce to smuggle him a Beretta 25 in the same fashion. Um, there's no confirmation it ever did happen. There's no photos of Fleming with a Beretta, so we just assume that it didn't happen. But he did write him a letter saying it'd be lovely for him to conceal a Beretta in a mink coat to get it to him.
Wow, very creative. So that actually, I'm glad you brought up the Beretta. Correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong here, but was that not the first sidearm that he assigned to James Bond in the first book? Am I remembering that
Yeah.
correctly?
Yep. So the Beretta 25, so he never specifies a model number. We make the argument in Licensed Troubleshooter that that model is one variation of the Beretta 418 series. I say variation because the gun actually was produced much earlier. There was like a model 1919 variant, a model 318 variant, and the 418. Because in that era, especially of arms development, people were really figuring out how to produce a semi-automatic handgun. So many aesthetic choices were modified, so much so that it actually became different variations of the same subproduct.
Hmm.
And so we don't know because he never specified. I mean, I can tell you the fabric and cut of the shirts and the suits and the ties down to the branding of his shaving soaps, but I can't tell you the model of the gun because, well, he got super fine line and a lot of that stuff he never did on the gun. He just said it was a skeleton grip Beretta 25. We make the inference and we make the argument. I think it's well laid out in the book of what it is. But yeah, it is the first official sidearm. Now, it's not the first gun that appears in the text. At the end of chapter 1, the secret agent of Casino Royale, he takes off a shoulder holster, which I guess we presume is the Beretta inside it because he takes it out later. But the first named firearm in the last paragraph of that first chapter is a sawn barrel Colt Police Positive 38. So he keeps that gun under his pillow.
Okay, I see. So you have a 418 model, don't you? I believe you've posted photos of it quite a few
Yes, I
times, haven't
do.
you?
I'm very proud of that particular one too, because not only did I buy it when I was broken in college, but I did it specifically because the date of manufacture, which is stamped on the frame, is 1953. So that was the first year. That April 13th, 1953 is when Casino Royale, the first James Bond novel, was published. So my
Oh,
gun
wow.
is from the original Bond year. That's
Wow.
pretty special to me.
Yeah, you're fully committed to the details right from the
It's
start. That's awesome.
all in the details.
Fantastic. I got to tell you a funny story. I haven't told you this previously, but the first time that I saw the photo, early on, I didn't really know much about you, about Bond either, quite frankly. But you posted a photo of that 418, and I thought, oh, that's cool that he's got a little Beretta, pocket pistol there. It's unfortunate that it came with a broken grip, though. That was my first thought. And then later on, I read and I kind of smacked my forehead. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's committed to the skeletonized description from the book.
Yeah, it's
Thank
not the
God I never
most
commented
functional
that
when
on
you're
any of
actually
the
going to
photos.
carry it. Hey, man, I would have told you I would have been happy to get new grips too, because the Bakelite covered ones they do crack occasionally. Mine have
Hmm.
not yet, thankfully. They're steel backed with Bake on the front. Bakelite just feels so good in the hand. The
Yeah.
skeletonization is one of the weirdest modifications that he made because the magazine, like the ASP actually,
Mhm.
has windows cut into either side, so all the rounds and the spring are all exposed. And then on one of the sides, you actually have I think it's the trigger sear assembly. The trigger bar is all exposed. So it's a striker fired pistol from the mid 40s. The striker is basically a pin spring holding things in place. So it's not exactly the safest handgun to begin with, while it does have a grip safety and a manual safety. So all that to say, I don't like when I do deep carry that pistol occasionally based on like non-permissive environments or things of that nature. It's got grips on it because I like keeping my body intact.
Yeah, yeah, very understandable. But it makes for some fantastic photos, though, honestly, which I
Oh
really
yeah,
appreciate.
aesthetically speaking, without the grips, it's insane. I was very fortunate to go visit the 1911 Syndicate out in Utah recently, and their videographer, he goes by his handle Crispy Visuals. He did an astound. I mean, I just stared at the video reel of my gun for such a long time. And
Hmm.
same with James Rupley, who does the photography for the Vickers Guide books and also mine because he's part of the head stamp team. Seeing it on the page, like the raw photo, not the edited one, he's like, "Oh, this is just in camera. It'll look better." I'm like, "How does it look better than what you put in front of me?" Like, and he has not failed to disappoint. Nothing has disappointed me yet. It's been so cool. So yeah, the gun photographs insanely well. And talking about committed to the cause, I had a friend of mine who owns a holster business, TH Holsters. He begrudgingly cut a chamois cloth because the leather holster that Ian Fleming prescribed for James Bond was a chamois leather holster. So he cut one up and stitched it together to make a very very ill-fitting loose holster because there's no structure to that fabric
Mm-hmm.
at all. But we did it for the book, and we did it just so we could have some good photography of it, and it was fascinating to kind of see it come together that way.
Sure, sure. So speaking of TH holsters, I love those guys because I have one of their holsters, which I believe you helped design, right? The PPK holster.
Yeah, the Spectre Mark III. I've got it in front of me right now as well. It is. I bullied him. He and I worked together professionally in the firearm space for a number of years, and I knew he had a holster company. And I said, "Hey, I love Bonds Vega. I love the idea of the aesthetic of that holster, but what I don't love is the lack of retention. Do you think you could? I bet you can," is how I framed it, because he was an engineering guy, and if you tell a guy that, it's going to happen. I was like, "I bet you can't stitch leather onto and glue it onto a Kydex holster successfully." He's like, "Oh yeah." And then we designed the holster exactly around the Vega, inspired by it, put the Walther branded discreet carry concepts clip on it, double stitched the bottom just like the Vega does. And yeah, you've got a pretty cool finished product. What I'm most proud of about it too is the fact that we do have a really solid tension screw design. So all I have to do is, because while they're roughly the same size, there are minor differences between different generations and calibers of PPK. So to carry like my pre-war 32 or any other 32, I just kind of tighten that tension screw a bit
Mm.
versus my 380, I just let it up a little bit. So it makes it really easy to carry all variations of the PPK because I've got a few these days.
Yeah, I can tell for sure. And I've got a stainless 380, like a more recent
Mm-hmm.
manufacturer, which I know is not a purist model, but I'm very happy with it, and I've carried it and shot it and all that, and it's a fun gun, and that holster works great with it as well.
That means a lot to me. I'm glad
Yeah,
to hear it, and that's a great gun.
absolutely. So how did the PPK of all things become like the iconic Bond sidearm?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions about this story, mainly because not because it was ever misrepresented by the people involved in the story, but just because, the game Telephone really does create distortion in history, which is, I'm sure you well know. Ian Fleming is writing these novels, and as the novels progress, the books get a lot more action oriented. Casino Royale, the bottom half of the book is like a love novel. The
Hmm.
first half is a gripping casino thriller. Live and Let Die is a gangster book. There's some action sequences, but it's a lot about organized crime, escape and evasion, all of that stuff. And that kind of just keeps going. But as he progresses, the violence and the action just keeps getting ramped up. And so a fan, Jeffrey Boothroyd, writes him and says, "Hey, I've really grown fond of this James Bond guy, and I kind of feel like he's not going to make it home anytime soon if he keeps going out for these more and more crazy missions with what he called, basically a prostitute gun." He said it's more fitting for a lady's handbag and not a very nice lady at that.
Oh wow.
Um, and he laid it out in this letter too. He got very flowery. And these, again, Man with the Golden Typewriter, cannot recommend it enough. There's a whole section in that book titled Letters to the Armorer, and it's the back and forth dialogue between these two guys. And in the first article, he just kind of goes all out. He's like, "This is what Bond should be carrying. This is what the Spectre agents should be carrying if we're to be accurate." And that's where it gets important, because that first article is what starts it all. Fleming is fascinated, but Boothroyd does not prescribe the PPK. He was reading a lot of American authors at the time. He lived in the UK, and he was a member, I believe, of, like, he was reading American Rifleman and a bunch of other, American firearm publications. He was very fascinated, which the American gun scene at the time was heavily built around the wheel gun, the Western, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. So I think Charles Askins was writing a lot of these things, and him and Elmer Keith were really into the Centennial Airweight, which was the new shiny at the time. And that one had a lemon squeezer, as people colloquially called it, grip safety on the back, and it was a 5-shot revolver. That's what he wanted James Bond to carry, and that's why a revolver holster was paired with it, which is the Burns Martin spring-loaded triple draw shoulder holster. That holster is interesting because it's an upside down rig that actually has a split front, and there's a spring, an L-shaped spring on either side that holds the gun into place, with a light pouch underneath that holds the trigger guard. So you're not worried about your gun falling out, but you have to do this really weird twist and rotate motion to rip, and you fight the spring all the way out, because it's not like the cylinder is the only thing being retained. You're like a Kydex holster where you're kind of just popping it out,
Mm-hmm.
As you rotate, that spring is remaining closed on whatever surface it's connected to. So the cylinder starts rolling out first, then the barrel. So you get this really aggressive draw stroke that's really interesting. But the Lightning triple draw, as it was called, could also be worn on the waistband. So you could take the shoulder holster harness off of it and thread it onto your belt to carry it either like this weird cross draw thing, which is what Boothroyd really liked, which had you shooting upside down with like your third finger or your pinky, super strange, or on strong side. So he wanted this convertible holster that was built around catching the revolver cylinder, and Fleming would later make up his own mind on a gun, but he would keep the holster. So that kind of created this super inaccurate pairing. So all that to say, Fleming wrote him back and said, "Hey, I really appreciate what you have to say. I'm very fascinated by you. You seem to be an expert in this field, blah, 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 blah." But they reach a roadblock on what he should carry. Fleming, again, who had his World War II bona fides, had actually spent some time with the commandos and had witnessed and shot himself, presumably based on his letters, the a suppressed Sten gun back in the day. So he knew that suppressors were real, and he knew the actual functionality of them. And he said James Bond needs a semi-automatic pistol so he can run a suppressor. That is a must. All this is taking place before the writing and during the writing of the novel From Russia with Love, which was the fifth book. And so Boothroyd's like, "No, I don't agree. Da 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 da." Fleming's like, "No, sorry. Here's what you can do for me, though." In one of your articles or one of your letters to me, you mentioned this article that was written, which is like, "What about the small automatics?" I believe is the name of it. It was written in 1953 or two, the same year either Casino Royale was being written or published. I don't remember offhand. In that article, someone in the United States actually did this test, this study of all the small arms during World War II, an endurance test, and ranked them all. And what's really cool is, so Boothroyd actually sends him that original article from that American rifleman. Fleming completely pulls all of the data tables, all of the text directly into his next book, Dr. No.
Oh, man.
So you can actually hold that article side by side with the book, which we do in my book, actually. One of the coolest things that we did, Headstamp has this history of being able to work with publishers in the space and stuff. We got full permission to republish that article. So I've got a beautiful photograph of it from James Rupley that'll be on the many page spread, so you can actually read the thing next to the text from Dr. No, and you'll see the immediate similarities between the two. But in that, the Walther PPK is ranked. It wasn't ranked first. It wasn't ranked second. I think it was like third or fourth, because it had a frame crack or whatever. Because mid-wartime guns were notorious due to how German overproduction, slave labor, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a diminishing quality effect. In fact, I have a wartime production gun that suffers from that. The safety channel was overmilled, and so my safety shifts around while I'm shooting, and the hammer's striking it, and it's actually fracturing safeties.
Man.
So looking to get that resolved. But anyway, I'm getting way too into the weeds on that. All that to say, Fleming went, "Hey, that's a pocket automatic. That's chambered in a cartridge that you can find very, very easily in Europe, where James Bond will likely be operating. We're going to go ahead and give him the PPK."
Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian-trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts.
So all that to say, a lot of people have said that, well, Boothroyd prescribed the PPK, and Boothroyd's never said that either. He was very clear that he had his own opinions and things. He made a great career for himself afterwards as a gun writer. He actually published a bunch of books about firearms. I've got a couple of them, and he was proud, and he did call himself James Bond's armor. But in all fairness, Ian Fleming gave him a signed copy of a book that literally said that on the inside. So that was given to him. He did not take it himself. But yeah, it's such a cool story because for me, the PPK is just as authentic of a Bond gun as the 418, because the 418, the Beretta, was based on Ian Fleming's personal firearms preferences and knowledge, because he actually carried a Browning 25, like the vest pocket in 1908, during his time in naval intelligence. And then later, after being chastised, he went out and did his own research and selected this tool. So the PPK authentically and organically becomes a James Bond gun because of Ian Fleming's willingness to adapt and then his own personal choices. So that's how it became the gun. And then what defined it absolutely, so that's the 6th novel, Dr. No, Chapter 2, Choice of Weapons, some of the best writing in the entire franchise, because Fleming actually, he's writing about the gun, the Beretta, being given away, but like the way he writes, you can read that and you're saying farewell to the original iteration of the character. Like he's actually acknowledging that he's developed and changed this character so much that he's like burying him and then bringing the new one to life. It's powerful stuff. But anyway, then Eon Productions makes their first film in 1962, and they choose Dr. No. And one of the first sequences that you see James Bond on screen is the famous PPK sequence, which features a PP. I won't get deep into the fact that every single gun in that movie is wrong. It's fun. It's hilarious. I love it. It gives me more to write about, so I really can't complain. All that he does some Walther PPK 7.65 millimeter with delivery like a brick through a plate glass window. The famous line, the gun's introduced, he's in black tie. It defines the franchise.
Yeah, no question about it. It certainly does. I actually just listened to one of your earlier interviews, and you talked about the continuity errors and such in Dr. No there. So there's a number of firearms that make appearances, I guess. Is that something that you cover in the book as well?
Oh, yeah. We have a whole section dedicated to what I jokingly call like the Russian nesting doll scenario of the Dr. No film, because the PP 380 is standing in for a PPK 32 automatic 7.65 millimeter. The PP is later replaced by FN Browning handgun, and then that is later replaced by a high power and a 1911, and it just, the spiral continues. And so yeah, we celebrate all of that, because I think that's the biggest thing for me is I'm not writing about that or talking about it in a way that's negative, because I love it. I think it's awesome. Like I said jokingly earlier, like it gives me more to write about, but frankly it's more about the series. And like you can't talk about Dr. No and the firearms without acknowledging that there's a bunch of errors, but you can do it in a different way, right? I'm not going to disrespect it. I'm going to say, yeah, it's a movie that was made back in 62, well before VHS. You might have been lucky to catch it on a rerun on television when it was brought back to theaters with another film or whatever the case may be. But these were not made to be watched 50,000 times. No one really thought like that. They were glad they had the rights to do all these movies, but out of the gate, they're like, well, let's see what we can do. And then From Russia with Love and Goldfinger just absolutely solidified the franchise, no question. And so I love the fact that we get to celebrate these little inconsistencies in a way it's fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that after hearing you describe it as well. And I do have to give the filmmakers on Dr. No a little bit of leeway, because they had no idea that they were birthing a practically immortal franchise at that time, and the whole communities that would develop around it, as you've seen and as you've been a part of.
The Queen in the 2012 Olympics, she had a stand-in skydive with her, right? Like she had James Bond and the Queen skydive into the opening ceremony of the UK Olympics. Like and she filmed an opening sequence with Daniel Craig. Like the staying power of James Bond
My gosh.
is undeniable. And really, I think the reason why, especially the monarchy, really flocks to James Bond as a character is because of what Fleming was doing. His books are his fictional celebration of, and his denialism of, Britain's waning relevancy in the post World War II era. Britain
Hmm.
destroyed by war, the great power structure completely changes. The United States becomes the global hegemon. Britain continues to wane. They continue to bleed colonies and they start to lose their power. But Fleming writes this character that time and again saves the CIA, goes to the United States and helps them out, stuff like that. So he builds a character that keeps Britain relevant in the international scene as a power, not just as a character.
Hmm.
He's on Her Majesty's Secret Service from day one. The same in the same year Casino Royale was published was when Queen Elizabeth II was coronated. So there's this whole journey. In
Hmm.
fact, up until she passed away recently, James Bond had only ever existed on Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that. That's fascinating. Dang. Well, Caleb, I want to jump way forward, at least in the movie
Totally.
timeline here, because you talked about the PPK, but then later on, much later on, the P99 is
Mm-hmm.
introduced, and you had some really interesting things to say about that as well. So, can you talk about how that actually came to fruition?
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite stories in the world of James Bond. I was very blessed with my travels and adventures for this book to actually spend a few days in Germany with Wolf Heinz Flaumer, who's the owner of Walther Arms. His son is now the managing director, Ike Flaumer, and Wolf bought the company in 1993 because it was lagging, it was flagging. He actually owned with his partner Umarex, which is an airgun manufacturer based out of Arnsberg, Germany, and he saw the opportunity to pick up Walther. Walther had gotten to a point, they had lost all these military contracts. They spent a ton of money in R&D and nothing really stuck, right? They throw out the Walther P5, HK throws out the P7. They do the MPK, HK throws out the MP5. The WA2000 versus the PS, the list goes on, and they never really got a contract that was super successful in the post-war era during the Cold War. And so the company had gotten to a point where they were selling prototypes, special edition models. It was from how they described it, the company was getting to a point where if it hadn't sold in 1993, not much more than the banner and the building would have been left.
Hmm.
Which is crazy. But the crazier part is Steyr was super eager to pick it up. So the Austrians were actually going to buy it. And they made a great show of it. They told everyone they were going to go out and buy it, this, that, and the other. And then they did the fatal European mistake. They went on holiday. And, and so there was a 3-day window where they were on holiday. And Umarex drew up the paperwork and bought the company while they were out of town,
Oh
which is
my
just
gosh.
incredible. I mean, talk about like a hostile, just aggressive, fantastic action. It was cutthroat. It was immaculate. It was flawless. And to Wolf's credit, he's like, I did not want to see a storied German firm leave the hands of Germany.
Hmm.
And so he immediately started hiring some of the best people in the industry in the weapons design field. In fact, one of the guys that led the P99 project, if I remember correctly offhand, was the lead designer on the Steyr AUG. So very fascinating stuff there. You buy it out from under this guy, and then they bring on one of his designers. It's just great. And so 3 years later, 1996, Tomorrow Never Dies is being filmed, and the P99 is in its prototype phase, its final prototype phase. So you've got a double single action, striker fired, decocker enabled polymer pistol, which has been unheard of. It's the first handgun that ever had removable back straps. It released with 3 different trigger mechanisms, with so many more right after launch to meet the unique needs of different law enforcement and military organizations and their contract requirements. And Flaumer went to the Tomorrow Never Dies set with a P99 in hand. There's some lovely photos of him actually on the set, and we do share those in my book because I got them from Wolf's personal collection. Um, there's that scene in Tomorrow Never Dies where James Bond gets his new BMW from Q. He's wearing that camel overcoat. They drop all the sides of the crate, and he does the remote control car thing, right?
Hmm.
So that's the day that they're filming. And there's this photo of Wolf. It's so cool of him handing Brosnan the P99, and he was adamant. He was telling him on set that the modern Bond must carry the modern Walther. It's okay for you to carry a PPK or to hold it, but you are the modern Bond, Pierce. You are the Millennium Bond. You are the new generation, and the new Bond must carry the new Walther. And he just kept drilling that home over and over again. And Pierce heard him. Brosnan heard him, and he loved him. He thought he was quite the character, and he actually got it added into the script. The third act of the movie was rewritten to include a line that Wolf basically fed Pierce about, the new Walther, I've been asking you to get me one of these. That line was fed by Wolf directly to Pierce, directly into the script, added into the film, and then you get this incredible third act where he's got a suppressed PPK and suppressed MP5K in the SAS Black, running and gunning and dual wielding. And that's how it appears in the film. And then credit to Pierce too. He did another promo shoot for the posters and stuff, and he included a suppressed P99. So that's how that gun got started, and it was well received, and it was the modern Walther, and so it became the dedicated sidearm. It actually replaces the PPK in the next film, The World Is Not Enough, and continued to be the mainstay Walther in Bond's hands through Casino Royale, with the caveat that Casino Royale's pre-title sequence actually show Bond with a PPK.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
When they're doing that, like a bathroom fight scene.
Yeah. I think I do. Yeah. I do remember. I saw that in the theater. What year did it come out? Like 1999 or something?
For Tomorrow Never Dies, that was 1997. Not to make you feel old, I was 6 months old when that hit theaters.
Wow. So I did see it in theaters, and I didn't know that much about James Bond other than, I enjoy the movies when I get the chance to see him. I didn't really know a whole lot about handguns, Walther, or anything. But that line, it left an impression on me, and I was immediately intrigued by, okay, there's a new Walther, and I don't know much about it, but it looks very different and looks very cool, and the coolest guy in the world is carrying it. So I have to imagine that they were flying off the shelves, so to speak, once they actually were made available to the public.
I can tell you right now that the P99 not only saved Walther, but it redefined the brand. The lineage of the P99 is still found in the modern guns that they produce, and they're backwards compatible. I can put a P99 slide on my PDP, which is their new gun, and it works just fine, and I can do that vice versa. My P99, actually, I have a threaded barrel in it. It's a new production PDP barrel. You can't go the other way because they did a different hexagonal cut on the P99 barrel, so you can't go up, but you can go backwards. It really, really did save the brand. And to your point, Wolf Flaumer was a genius marketer. When he was just selling air guns in Umarex, he said, I need to sell the vision and story of America to Europe, because the guns they were selling were replicas of American firearms, right? Like lever action rifles, 6-shooters, and that kind of thing. So he, in the 70s, started duplicating the aesthetic of 1950s, 60s, 70s Marlboro ads from the United States to sell air guns, because he wanted to sell the vision of the American West. So he took that aesthetic and repackaged it, and he was a storyteller. So he knew the staying power and importance of Bond, and you could tell that Bond and Pierce Brosnan is his James Bond, because when you walk into the Walther Museum in Ulm at their headquarters, you open the door, the lights kick on, the Bond theme song starts blasting, but the lights really aren't on you. There is a light shining directly down onto a 25-foot banner of Pierce Brosnan with the 007 logo. So, you walk in, the Bond theme's blasting, and there's Pierce Brosnan right there holding the P99.
Man, fantastic. He knows how to set the stage.
Oh, yeah. And it does, the song plays the entire time you're in that museum.
Very cool.
and Pierce is right there watching you. So it's pretty cool. But I just love that. Like I said earlier, I'm a marketer myself, and I believe in the power of storytelling and this and that. And the P99 and its story with James Bond is a story of successful brand building, authenticity, and because at the end of the day, you can market a product as hard as you want, but if it doesn't back up the promise that you're trying to sell, you're gonna fade away. The gun delivers. It is still one of the best pistols I have ever shot. It is one of my favorite to pull out on the range, because you have friends that spend an exorbitant amount of money trying to make their Glock more functional, and then I hand them a factory trigger from 1997 that has a 1/10 of an inch reset, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, but the polymer gun was perfected in 1997.
That's awesome, man. Caleb, I got to tell you, when I saw that you had visited the Walther factory. I guess this was last year, like middle of last year, maybe.
Yeah,
And you
this
got to
May.
put together this May.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're talking about the Walther. Yeah, Walther USA. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you got to put the PPK together for yourself. Was that last
Yes,
year or was that this year?
that was last November. So that
Okay,
was
oh
last
yeah, I thought it
fall.
was a while back. Yeah,
So
I
it's
was
been about a
stunned.
year.
I was just stunned that you had that level of access, really, and influence, and I was just incredibly impressed that you pulled that off. Honestly, so you have a
I
PPK that you've put together in the factory yourself, right?
Yes, I'm insanely blessed. The guys at Walther are far too generous to me. They've really taken great care of me over the last few years, and I've been blessed to be part of a lot of really cool projects with them. The first thing that I got to do was they, and these are things that are offered to me that I'm not like knocking on doors, but they're like, hey, we love what you're doing, and we love how much you love us, so let's kind of authentically work together and be friends. I got a phone call one day, and they're like, hey, would you want to do the hero image photography for our new product brochure? I'm like, yeah, of course. That's actually how I got my stainless steel PPK.
Hmm.
Was I photographed a stainless steel PPK. They put this photo of mine full spread in their brochure that they hand out at SHOT Show, and they put photo by Caleb Daniels in the bottom corner. And as a thank you for my photography, they sent me a stainless steel gun to match what I had captured. So that means a lot to me. I got to do the photography on the final edition P99, the challenge coin that went with that. The back of it has a Tomorrow Never Dies inspired motif of a necktie, suit, and the P99 laying across.
Oh man.
So I got to do the principal photography on that, which was again something that they reached out to me on, and it was super super cool. And most recently, aside from building this gun, which I definitely want to get to, but I just want to talk about like how generous and kind Walther is. They came out to me and brought the new 32 Walther PPK the week before it launched because they wanted me to do the lifestyle photography for it. So the real reintroducing the PPK and 32 automatic shows me actually in a Henley shirt, similar to actually what I'm wearing right now,
Mm-hmm.
and a Barber jacket, a Barber Buford that I bought because of Fred Burton and the DSS relationship with that jacket back in the 80s. Holstering the new 32 PPK, chambering around and holstering it in my shoulder holster in my studio in my basement, and I got to
Oh
do
man.
all the lifestyle photography that went with that launch. So it was a very surreal experience.
I'll
Um,
bet. That's so
they're
cool.
just such good people, and they're such good friends, and there's
Mm-hmm.
always something new that they're reaching out to me about, and I'm so blessed. And building my own PPK, assembling it was the coolest thing in the world. I'd been to the plant before, and I'd been there a few years previously. All the PPKs in the world are now being produced in Arkansas, and when I had been there last, it was back in like 2020 probably.
Hmm.
It was no bigger than my apartment, the production floor for the PPK, and it was 800 square feet at the time. And in the 3 years, it had quintupled in size. I went there with a couple friends actually. I was there with the group on one day. We were recording some podcasts and such. That was with High Caliber History, Logan Metesh, and the Gun Broker crew who puts on the No Lowballers podcast for gun brokers. So I watched them build guns, and we did some podcasts there on site about James Bond, espionage, that kind of thing. The next day, a good friend of mine, David Zaritsky of the Bond Experience, flew in, and the two of us got to assemble guns together. Now, I did the math. I was told all the people that had been allowed to build or assemble their own handgun, their own PPK series gun on that floor before. And when I got there that day, I realized that David was going to be, me and him were going to be number 6 and 7. So I pushed David in front of me. I said, hey, you're going first. I'm going to be the seventh person to do this if you don't mind. All about the details, man. All about the details.
Yep. Oh man,
And
that was a
so
smart move on your part.
Oh yeah. I mean, so now I got the story. And what was really, really cool for me is they asked me what model I wanted. And I'm like, I don't have a PPKS yet because it's not actually a Bond gun. Although the words are said in Skyfall, the model shown is clearly a Walther PPK. But at the time, I was deep invested in the research for my book, and I discovered that MACV SOG, had actually requisitioned and carried suppressed Walther PPKS pistols in combat during Vietnam.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, okay, like what do I not have? I don't have a PPKS. And they had this great matte black finish that they did at the time. It's this black melanite that is very reminiscent of like what the OSS and SOE, like with the Suncorite coating they'd put on those guns. Um, and so I'm like, fantastic, I'll build one of those. And then to further do the Vietnam homage, I actually bought a set of 1970s Pachmeyer Signature Series grips. And what was very common back in the day then for 1911 specifically is people would buy these grips and they'd cut the center out so you'd have access to the front checkering of your 1911. Well, I didn't love the wraparound, so I cut it off just as the 1911 guys would, and created for myself kind of this Vietnam homage pistol. And now it's a very important piece of my collection that I love.
Oh man, that's fantastic. You're living the dream, man. I'll tell you what, I've never had an opportunity like that, but I would love one.
It was
Unforgettable,
the
I'm sure.
blessing of the century, man. Those
Hmm.
guys are so cool. And they're going to release 5 new pistols. All I have to say is don't cash in your 401k, but be emotionally prepared to spend money
Wow,
because the
wow, wow.
pistols that are going to
Okay.
come out of that are going to be pretty cool.
Oh wow, very cool. Okay, yeah, I'll definitely have to keep an eye on that. I was not aware of that, although I do follow them on Instagram, so I'll have to see what they have coming. Then that's awesome.
Definitely.
Okay, cool. So you built this relationship with Walther that's really amazing. But I also want to talk about you and Headstamp Publishing a little bit
Yeah,
now, because
absolutely.
your book will be the first one of theirs that I own. I've already pre-ordered yours, but
Thank you.
I've been nothing but impressed by what I've seen from them online so far. Anyway, so can you talk about how they are, kind of different in the publishing world?
Absolutely. So I'll kind of say how I found them because I think that helps differentiate them so well. Is if you're part of the firearms space, or even if you're not, you've probably run across the Larry Vickers series of books, the Vickers Guide. These are these gorgeous tabletop coffee table books that are large format, very well photographed, and very well documenting these very unique firearms. They've done 3 volumes now on HK. They've done 2 volumes on 1911s, two on the AR-15 platform, couple on the AK, and these were kind of just becoming the ultimate collector's version and aesthetic standard for a book in the firearm space. And so when I left the firearms industry full time back in, was that 2021, 2022, something like that, in that fall, I think it was fall 22. I went from working like 70 hours to like a lot less, and I was very bored. And I said, "Hey, I had this book idea that I've been wanting to do my whole life. Let's pitch it." So I'm like, well, I'm not going to start writing until I have a publishing agreement with someone. So, well, let's just do the thing that I wanted, which was work with the people that did the Vickers Guide. So I looked into who did it, which was Headstamp Publishing, or Montlake Publishing, which is another company owned by the same people that do Headstamp. And I was like, oh, exceptional. I'm the luckiest guy alive because James Rupley, one of the co-owners of Headstamp, who does all the photography, followed me on Instagram already.
Oh wow.
So it made my life much easier because I didn't have to like oversell the fact that the guy with the 12-year-old face actually knew what he was excited about and all this. Like he had some sort of documentation that I knew, I stood on business when it came to this stuff, and I knew what I was talking about to some degree. And so, it's him, Ian McCollum, and another gentleman who have founded this company that's really dedicated to creating the these very well produced books celebrating the world of firearms in a way that no one else has ever. And I think that's what's really cool about them. They do a magnificent job. Ian has published a lot of really unique books through the label. His first book was Chespo de Famas. Not that I'm good at French, but that's what I believe the pronunciation is, and it celebrates the history of the French rifles now from the 1800s forward. They did another one with Jonathan Ferguson of the Royal Armories on British rifle production, same kind of way. And they've done one. Ian's most recent book, I believe, is, well, aside from the Small Arms of World War II series they're now doing, was a book about Pistols of the Warlords, which
Hmm.
was, talk about micro niche. It was a book about Chinese replica pistols in the early 20th century of American designed firearms. Um,
Yeah.
and they're fascinating. The book is so cool. So that's what I love is like the topic area doesn't have to be, it's got to be quality. There's got to be ample ability to capture it. And then, to some degree, you do need a good market because, this thing has to break even. And that's what I love about Headstamp is because they're self-publishing, it's a small publisher, but they operate similarly to a lot of self-publishers where my book launched via Kickstarter for the pre-sale because that's how they glean the understanding of, okay, here's how many units we could probably do in this book after the fact, because obviously we're going to pre-sale, like you mentioned, and I appreciate. And as people pledge, more things get unlocked. Like most recently, we unlocked a new one. It's visible. We haven't actually hit the goal yet. I think it's at the $400,000 mark. A profile on Billy Waugh for the book, which I thought was a great inclusion because we do a lot of real world history in
Hmm.
relationship to James Bond, and the fact that Billy Waugh was basically operating in the same era, top to bottom, as James Bond has been a character, but where James Bond had been recast 5 times, he was just taking care of business, is a story that I think is
Yeah.
worth celebrating. So
Incredibly
anyway,
unique.
like that's the benefit is we get to we get to challenge ourselves to do more. We get to engage with people in a very unique way, and then we get to create a beautiful finished product. We're already fully funded. We got that done in the first few hours, and we keep cruising up. But that's Headstamp. They're a really brilliant boutique publishing house, and what's great is I have a guy like Ian McCollum as my technical editor. So the two of us really get to challenge each other and learn and grow. Just as I'm teaching them about James Bond stuff, he's helping me with small arms research that was kind of gate kept, not because it's intentional, but because a lot of the stuff that he reads about is in books that have been out of production or out of print for 50 years that I can't find, or I don't even know to look for. And so, he's really helped flesh out my knowledge on a lot of things, and the same way that I've challenged them to start reading the Bond books and stuff like that. And it's been a really great journey because I enjoy the company of both those guys, in addition to the purpose of their company, and of course they took a chance on me, and I'll never be able to thank them enough for that.
Yeah, that's really amazing story, honestly. So when I logged in the other day to check out the pre-orders, I was just totally blown away at how well sales were going. And I don't know what your own projections were, but you had far exceeded what I was anticipating seeing on day one. And Caleb, I believe you're my youngest podcast guest yet out of the past 4 years. It's your first book, and you're already at six figures in sales in pre-orders, and that's just an unbelievable accomplishment in my mind. I'm blown away, and I'm very, very happy for you, man.
Thank you. I'm very, very blessed. Like I said, this book wasn't going to happen without a guy like Headstamp, because James Bond and that brand demands the elegance that Headstamp books, provide. And
Totally agree.
it was my opinion that if I did this as like a self-published affair, it wasn't going to do the source material the true justice that I could. And I can do photography, but I'm not at the level of James Rupley. I am very blessed though that a lot of my photos actually do appear in the book. That's one of the things I'm most excited about. If people are familiar with the Headstamp books, is traditionally they might have like two or three lifestyle, if you will, photos. We have a ton. We have like over 50. And because we like I said at the top of this interview here, is James Bond doesn't exist in a vacuum. His guns don't exist in a vacuum. And so I brought in subject matter experts and friends of mine who have written books about the tailoring of James Bond, to write articles about the impact of James Bond's tailoring in its relation to carrying firearms and such, or folks that are subject matter experts on particular firearms or historical events to kind of flesh out those things, or watches. One of my favorite sections in the book, we went to my friend Lorenzo, who runs a page called Omega Bond Watches on Instagram.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So Lorenzo owns every screen accurate Omega watch from the entire franchise. We captured his collection. We get to share those, and we did some great lifestyle shots, P99 shoulder holsters, because the world of Bond. And we also did that because it was very difficult to, and unfortunate that we could not share stills from the films. We couldn't get the rights to that. So, like my Instagram, where I try to create lifestyle moments and aesthetic things that create the motif of James Bond, like, oh, that's that particular movie, that's that particular scene. We worked together where I got to lay out photos, and James got to use his exceptional photography skills to capture and celebrate the world of James Bond in a way that I don't think ever has been done on a page before.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, yeah, I've only seen a couple of photos so far that are on the pre-order page there, but they're just extremely impressive stuff. And
Thank you,
the amount of knowledge that you're demonstrating right now for the subject matter tells me that the content beyond the photos is going to be very enlightening and eye-opening as well. So I'm very much looking forward to reading it.
That means a lot to me, man. I mean, this is a project that I've been wanting to do my whole life. I had a good laugh. I pulled out one of the Scholastic James Bond coffee table books that I had when I was a kid, and a bunch of printer paper fell out of it, and it was a bunch of drawings and write-ups that I had done about James Bond when I was 10, trying to do a little book of my own, like 15, 20 years ago now. And
cool.
It's really cool to see that full circle. I mean, it's been a lifelong dream, clearly. So it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to me that guys like you, who I've been friends with in this space for so long, are willing to celebrate it with me. Because stuff like this, if you just throw it into the void, it just exists in a vacuum too. And I want to do the character, and I want to do these brands, most importantly, these brands justice, because I think the biggest injustice in the cinematic space particularly is that the world of firearms is often painted in a very negative light, and the people in the brands behind these tools aren't given their due. This book to me is a celebration of their efforts, their tools, the real world history behind them, the actual operators who used them to shine a light and continue my mission of normalizing this equipment and getting it out of the shadows where it's not an ugly thing to talk about.
Hmm. Very
So
cool. Yeah,
that's
that's a
that's a
very
big
great
thing for
goal.
me here. Those are
Man.
maybe lofty goals, but I hope we conquer them.
Well, you seem to have a habit of hitting goals, so I think you're doing well. So
Thanks.
I know that you still have some work to do. I know there's still some things going on with the book right up until it's actually published, but do you
Mhm.
have any other projects in mind once you've actually got this one out in the world and you can, be confident in the finished product?
Absolutely. I wanted to be a writer my whole life. If my career in this, which is a bold word to use, but if my writing career begins with celebrating my favorite cinematic character and his relationship with my favorite industry in the world, then I really can't complain about that at all. I don't want to say what I'm thinking of next, but I will say that there are. I threatened head stamp, and I use that word truly because I'm sure they've been stressed all hell with all the things I put them through trying to do this book. That this is only the beginning. The day I pitched them this book, I had 7 others on a sheet, and that sheet has only continued to grow in length.
Oh, wow.
Um, and these are projects that I could do with them because I love what they do, and I love the space that they're in, and I think there's so many exciting things to go down that aren't just pop culture related that I could do with them and continue my own knowledge journey. I really do want to go on an educational journey my whole life in the subject matter, and if I can continue to share that with people and repackage it in a way that's very easy to access and is because at the end of the day, what I want this book to be, and the reason why I really wanted it to be in the coffee table format, is I think it's written for the people that might not be super gun folk, but are more Bond folk. They can
Hmm.
sit down, open it with their morning coffee, read a section, in the same way like spy shots, right? Like you let people engage with a story, and then they set it down and they walk away and they go through life. They picked up some cocktail conversation, and now they're interested in learning more, so they'll revisit. I don't
Yeah.
expect that audience to read the whole book cover to cover on day one. I wouldn't complain if they did, but if they're sitting down and they're engaging with it over time and they're growing with it, then that's fantastic.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Fantastic goals. And, I totally understand that you're not wanting to speak
Got to
about
play
your
some
upcoming
cards close
project.
to my chest.
Yeah, I would say at least half of my guests refuse to tell me what their next big project is because I understand that you're kind of releasing a little bit of that magic, honestly, when you start to talk
Yeah,
about something before you've worked on it. So that's something I've adopted as well for the most part, and that's
yeah, it's
smart.
tricky
But
to know when to pull that trigger. We pulled this trigger with a Watches of Espionage blog a few years back, and I don't regret that. But it did let it out of the bottle a little bit, and then people are like, okay, when is it happening? I'm like, well,
yeah,
I
yeah, that's
hope
the
that
thing.
I take that away from you a little bit because we've been on this journey for 2 years, and so you're
Hmm.
like, okay, he's been working on it for so bloody long, it's got to be done.
No, I promise you, I will never hold anyone to the deadline that they set at the beginning of a project because I've learned that lesson very, very well at this point. I can assure you of that.
Oh
But
yeah.
I know that you're also out there, working every single day and making it happen. And we've seen you, just rise and rise and rise over time. So I'm very excited for whatever is coming next, and I know that you'll do just an absolute bang up job of it.
Thanks. And you got good early knowledge on this book, like I said earlier. So just keep stopping by the Cabot or Alchemy booth where I'm gonna keep hanging out for the indefinite future it shows, and maybe I'll have some cool things to tell you next year.
Awesome, awesome, man. Yeah, maybe I'll see you again in January. Then I guess we'll see.
That'd be lovely. We'll have to get
Cool.
a drink.
So, Caleb, we've been talking, of course, about your online presence. Can you just let everybody know where they can find you online, though,
Yeah,
if they want to connect after listening to this?
absolutely. On Instagram, it's at Commando Bond, all one word. Definitely type it all the way out because I do firearms content on a meta platform, which means unless you do that, you won't find
Oh
me.
yeah,
You can also find me I have a website, commandobond.com, just as easy. And then finally, we did launch a YouTube channel, Commando Bond. I keep it pretty simple. But the last thing that I do want to shout out too is a friend of mine and myself recently launched a podcast called Steel and Style. You can find it on YouTube and Spotify under that handle. It's myself and Eli Duckworth of Alchemy Custom Weaponry or 1776 Duck on Instagram, talking about classic style, firearms, the things that we love. Uh, he's very Macho Man Randy Savage to my 007 aesthetic, and so we get to riff off each other quite a bit, and it's a lot of fun.
wow, wow. Well, you already won me over with that title, Steel and Style. That's incredible.
Thank
So
you.
you got the touch. I'll definitely tune in that case.
Cheers.
Awesome, man. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure that we'll catch up again sooner or later. I'm looking forward to getting that book in my hands. When is it actually going to ship?
Yeah,
I know
so
that
the
it's available
Kickstarter
now.
we have it noted is roughly April 25 is the goal. So hoping to meet that and maybe exceed it. I can't speak for them. They'll probably kill me for using the words exceed it, but expect April. Expect April to May. That's
Awesome.
a judicious answer.
Okay. I already know it's going to be worth the wait.
I appreciate that a lot, man.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Caleb. I will talk to you soon.
Sounds good, Justin. Cheers.
Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.